The last video I wrote was the Anthropology of the Left, and this is the second video in a two-part series. This video took a lot of time for me to think over how to write it. The Anthropology of the Left was pretty easy to structure in a manner pretty similar to how I wrote the communism or Christianity videos, which I based off how I write civilization videos. In that, there's this coherent society, which started out under certain incentive structures with certain groups of people. They in turn operate under certain logical principles which you can study, all of which inevitably results in the strengths or weaknesses, which then in turn predict what the future or natural endpoint of its logic is. I've done this for like 20 different videos, so it's a format I know how to do pretty easily. I normally don't show people how I make the sausage for these videos, mostly because it's pretty boring and your role here is to enjoy yourselves and learn stuff, not feed my ego. However, in a process of figuring out how to write this video, it actually informs the entire way I thought about the entire topic. The longer I spent trying to think about how to write about explaining the right, the more it actually changed how I thought about the right as a completely different organism. One of the most important points of the last video is something that Thomas Sowell said, that the left is a single coherent thing. It's an ideology which believes that humans are blank slates, that it's the duty of the society to socially engineer to push towards utopia, that human societies are like machines, which if engineered correctly can reach utopia, and society should be structured off equality, secularism, and the simplification of ethnic, sexual, family, religious, and other collective ties. This is the underlying mission that all leftists stretching back to the French Revolution, the Russian or Chinese civil wars, leading to modern Antifa or the Democratic Party would agree with. The left has a shared vision of the future. Those who accept that future are leftists, and those who reject it are conservatives. What does that make conservatives? The conservatives are whoever's against the left. This includes a wide variety of people, whether the Taliban, neocons, boomer cons, Nazis, libertarians, religious fundamentalists, or a dozen other groups. It's the whole issue I've brought up in several videos that almost everyone before the Industrial Revolution is in the authoritarian right corner of the political compass, but it's just insane to put the Roman, Chinese, or Islamic empires alongside 18th century France or India in the same political bracket. 99% of generations over history were people who we would call far-right fanatics today. Once you look deeper, you find these groups share very little in common except a shared enemy, that being the left. Through this shared enemy, all conservatives end up with the position that we should maintain more of the pre-industrial culture. How do you tell the story of those groups? How do you possibly explain it? As a conservative myself, this forced me to do a degree of introspection. Who am I? I decided to tell the conservative story as a series of independent stories of the different factions inside the right, which all have different start points. I invented names for these groups, which really aren't meant to be perfect except at conveying some underlying group. There are 4 factions of these which we will go through in this video. The story of the last 200 years has been as the world has industrialized and man has achieved godlike powers. The greatest question of our time is how much to rely on said godlike powers and how much to rely on the pre-industrial traditions. Let's not pretend that the answer to this question was obvious until recently or even now. The Industrial Revolution has changed so much that it's not clear what rules to keep or what to throw away. I have my own conclusions, in which I'm not sure they're correct, but I came to these conclusions after reading hundreds of books on human nature and history, which I can't expect other people to do. To play the devil's advocate for the left, it makes sense to throw away some nasty pre-industrial things like foot binding, female genital mutilation, slavery, serfdom, amongst others, but there is a line where you're crazy. It's a battle that's been going on for over 200 years, fought on nearly every continent between the followers of the machine and those who chose to stand against it. Whether in revolutionary France, World War II, Tsarist Russia, the Cold War, or in Africa. Here we go. What is the story of those who fought against the machine? In many places, a seemingly hopeless battle against the irrepressible god of progress. What kind of men were driven to that kind of madness, to say no to history? One of the biggest issues our nation faces, if not the biggest issue now, is our crippling debt. And going forward for the right, I think we need to establish a policy of limiting debt so we don't end up in the current situation we're in. And when it comes to staying out of debt, there's no one better than PDS Debt. And with PDS Debt, you too can find the best way to stay out of debt. PDS Debt has customized options for anyone struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills. If you're making payments every month on your debt and your balances aren't going down, this program is for you. Everyone with $10,000 or more in eligible debt qualifies, and there is no minimum credit score required. PDS provides a service to match you with debt solutions tailored to your financial situation. I know a lot of people are really struggling with debt, and PDS Debt is there to help you, which is why I want to intro them to you. And for my viewers, PDS Debt is offering a debt-free analysis. It only takes 30 seconds. Head over to pdsdebt.com/whatifaltist to get your debt-free assessment today. So check out PDS Debt and get out of debt now. Part 1. Peruvian Rightism. Latin America is one of the regions of the world I study that I wish other people would study more. In fact, one of the big questions that got me into reading history and anthropology was, why is Mexico poor and America rich? The vision of the world our society has requires a tremendous amount of cherry picking, ignoring almost all of human history except some Western intellectuals we like since the Renaissance or certain ancient Greeks and Romans. What that means is that our society ignores what the human condition looks like for almost all people over history. I like to say that anthropology textbooks act like everyone is an educated, secular Anglo yuppie living in a suburb of Boston. I'm an Anglo from Pennsylvania, and I still feel like modern anthropology or sociology doesn't understand me at all. One of the anthropology rules I have is that if your theory of human nature can't explain India or Africa first, not focusing on the bizarre aberration that is the West as your main mental model, then you've completely failed. That interesting digression aside, the reason I like reading about Latin America is that it offers its own vision of human nature and the world, one that our society doesn't want to look at. What the history of Latin America is that a small group of virile Iberians conquered the region, and in all but a few countries, about a dozen families descended from the original conquistadors own most of the land and property. Latin America is not a story of the glory of human nature or progress. Many revolutions have come and gone, but even those who work just make the dictators into a new nobility, and the communists treat the common people even worse than the old nobility did. Latin America is the story of entrenched corruption staying forever, with no hope for end. The great irony is that this story is much more applicable to most of the human race than the West's story of progress and dominance. In most societies in history, there's a nobility that runs everything. They keep the peasants and merchant classes down while they ally with the church to exploit the peasants. The reason I call this the Peruvian right is that Peru is a very prime example of this, where the conquistadors allied with the church to keep down the local Andean population, pushing for social conservatism at all times. I know that in most cases this system is less bad than it sounds, where lots of people have lived prosperous or happy lives inside feudal autocracies, but the reason the West rose to complete global dominance was that it broke out of the twin tyrannies of the lord and priest to create science, capitalism, and freedom. Western conservatives are so embroiled in the context they exist in that when they hear about conservatives in Peru, Burma, or Pakistan, they think that they're somewhat alike. The irony is that conservatives in most of the world don't stand for the high principles American conservatives talk about, like freedom, capitalism, or honor. Instead, they just want to stay in charge as a nobility. The political divide that exists in most historic societies is that between more socially liberal landowners and messianic populist religious fundamentalists. Of course, history is complicated and this is a ridiculous oversimplification, but that's the breakdown you see inside societies the most often. The Taipings versus the Manchus, the church versus state in medieval Europe, the Sunni versus Shia in the Abbasid Caliphate, Protestants versus Catholics, even really really the right versus the left today, or being rural land-owning America versus the cult of progress amongst others. In general, the nobility were more chill on social or sexual issues, while the religious authorities played to egalitarian, messianic, and populist notions. In these sorts of situations, the socially liberal conservatives are the landowners. A friend of mine once said that Latin American politics boils down to the left saying that you can take the evil rich's stuff, and the right saying that you can keep your land and maintain the current racial caste system if the left doesn't win. That's a pretty accurate assessment. Most Americans have no concept of how classist Latin America is. Although there are very important exceptions, and these tend to be history's great nations like Rome, Britain, America, China, or Russia, in which the ruling class or nobility is imbued with some sense of honor, values, or higher purpose, that isn't the case for most societies in history. These are the conservatives who support the status quo because they are the status quo, not the rebel coalition, which is the American right today. Examples of this type of conservative are, again, a lot of conservatives in Latin America, barring the more innovative ones like Javier Milei or the Bukeles, most conservatives in Southeast Asia or in pre-industrial societies, the Confucians in China, or the nobility in pre-industrial Europe like France before its revolution. Hitler's biggest enemies once he got into power weren't the left, it was the old Prussian nobility who supported insurfing the local Slavs while they saw Hitler as a commoner who insulted their honor. I'm going to say something controversial here, and I think a lot of established conservatives today in the Western world have become a group like this. I think there is a sizable amount of conservative incorporated who are just conservatives because they're in power and want to keep their stuff. The thing is that people would never question this group's dominance before the Industrial Revolution. This was since change was so slow, you expected a king and nobility to dominate since you didn't know anything else. In England in 1400, the nobility were just those who were in charge, and that was how the world worked. As Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, said, all systems naturally gravitate towards autocratic monarchies. I'm not going to put monarchy down that much here, given probably over 90% of states in history were monarchies, and most of the greatest rulers and leaders in history were monarchs ruling through divine right. For stable societies, monarchs end up with pretty good incentive structures since there's an active incentive towards stable long-term governance rather than short-termism in oligarchies or democracies due to passing on the governance through the family line. There's this whole faction of libertarians today who say monarchies are the freest form of governance for normal people, which is true in some situations, as I explain in this text wall. Thus, in a society in which change is pretty slow, in which your life is the same as your great-grandpa's, almost every single country in the world would be a monarchy, which is how most of history has been. With the Industrial Revolution, this sort of conservatism stopped being socially doable, given society changed so fast that a monarch ruling in the most stable way possible stopped being effective. This is why societies leave this system by one way or another as they industrialize. In general, once a society industrialized, the more advanced it is, the more likely it is to go conservative and the less leftist. Western Europe and its diaspora went for capitalism or fascism, while Eurasia went for communism. This form of status quoism only really survives today in pre-industrial societies like parts of Latin America, Africa, or Southeast Asia. Mexico's an interesting test case here in that, given they've industrialized within the last generation, I could see the formation of a new dynamic type of politics that moves beyond the old conquistador nobility. The marker of this type of elite is the uplifting of old institutions at the expense of ideology, and on top of that, a small de facto nobility using the institutions to create a certain kind of incestuous alliances between private enterprise, government, bureaucracy, and the church. I would call this l'ancien regimization, if people could pronounce that, given France before the revolution was like that. The French monarchy had all of these various hyper-complex guild or treaty agreements. France was legally a series of subdivided nations, which all had different relations with the French monarchy. The French government had all of these various regulations which held France back, carving out one part of the economy or another for certain people who could bribe the French government. Over time, this system became incredibly corrupt, so much so that the merchant classes arose to kill the nobility with the French Revolution. In all honesty, this variety of conservatism is more a function of entropy than any real principles. No matter what ideology, any system will evolve into this over time. We're seeing this exact same process occur in America, and even more horrifyingly so, China, countries with opposite ideologies. Most of the American economy is regulated by special interests to benefit them, creating incestuous relationships between private enterprise and the state. Whenever I get a look at modern America's elite, they have the attitude that they are in power because they're just better, and thus they don't have to do anything to prove why they deserve to be elites. This system is ironically conservative in its original meaning in that it supports the status quo. Even if the status quo itself is left-wing, it's conservative in that it's trying to maintain its own power. Hey everybody, you guys should check out my second podcast, History 102, where I explain various historic topics like the American Revolution, the fall of Rome, or Mesopotamia. Now back to the video. Part 2, British Rightism. It's funny that we call this group conservative, given it's also liberal at the exact same time. This confusion is due to deliberate strategies on the part of the left to obfuscate terminology to confuse people so that no one can actually understand what the left is trying to say. Thus, the left can do whatever they want and not be held accountable for anything. That's why the phrase liberal means 4 different things depending on who you ask. However, for this video, we mean liberal in its first meaning. That is, like the British Empire or the American Founding Fathers, limited government intervention in society or the economy with a liberal democracy, property rights, and freedom as the dominant values. I'm calling this British Rightism given it was first developed and championed there, alongside the Netherlands. Although, ironically, Britain has basically completely deviated from this, with America practically being the only country with any semblance of this anymore, even though it's fighting a desperate defensive campaign against leftism. The greatest target of leftism at this point, ironically more so than even genocidal or legitimately misogynistic regimes, is the old school British conservatives. The left loathes every part of their social order and has spent the last century more trying to destroy even the memory of their existence. It's funny to hear that Francis Fukuyama in the 1990s basically predicted that British-style rightist regimes had unilaterally won history due to achieving such perfection and domination. Classical liberal regimes have property rights, parliaments, individualism, and a free market. The great irony was that, like all successful organisms, British rightism was so successful as to cause its own demise. This is a pattern we'll find. Aristotle, alongside about half a dozen other pre-industrial philosophers, said that the greatest issue with democracy was that it gave the public what it wanted too much, thus making the public weak, decadent, short-sighted, greedy, and lazy over the course of centuries. Likewise, Western-style capitalism was so successful that it created huge industrial structures that could only be led by managers who either had specialized knowledge of arcane industrial mechanical things or who managed the bureaucratic structures themselves. British rightism is the natural endpoint of the bourgeoisie class, ranging from the petty shop owner to the steel mogul. This is since this group benefits from stable government that honors property rights and keeps its taxes low. Over time, as the companies made by the founders grew larger, the bureaucrats rose inside them, a process that Sam Francis and James Burnham talk about in great length. This was done covertly over the course of the 20th century, reaching a tipping point around the world wars when every country in the Western world adopted what was effectively economic socialism. Keep in mind, top tax rates in Britain and America in 1960 were 95% and 90% respectively. Due to being gradual and an unofficial process, British rightism was gradually replaced with consensus liberalism, becoming the new ruling class. This is why America or Britain feel like completely different countries from their founders a few centuries ago, even though both are technically liberalism, since we moved from classical liberalism to technocratic liberalism. In America, federalism allowed more of British rightism to survive through local states' power. Meanwhile, poorer countries maintained more of it, given this system is the best at creating wealth in the world ever. British rightism or classical liberalism created the industrial, scientific, agricultural, digital, and other revolutions, as you can see in this text wall. That's since the low regulations and taxes establish good incentive structures to just create stuff. This is why the Anglo-Saxon countries have consistently been the wealthiest, most technologically advanced, and ruled the world for the last few centuries. To backtrack a little bit, this system was a gradual evolution over the early modern period. It pulls on pretty early threads in that republics have existed in Europe ever since the Greeks or Romans, who have also had their own versions of capitalism, which lead back into the Middle Ages. Due to the merchant classes winning in Britain and the Netherlands, later followed by their diasporas, parliamentary democracies arose in said societies. This was very rare at the time in that every single country in the world, with one or two theocracies, was a monarchy in the early 18th century. People forget that there were two Enlightenments: the Romantic Rousseau French Enlightenment, and then the Locke empirical scientific conservative British Enlightenment. These manifested in the American and French revolutions, in which I can point out that the American Revolution created a stable republic for 250 years, while the French Revolution collapsed into autocracy within months. This was since the underlying difference was that the British Enlightenment believed that human nature was flawed, while the French that it was perfectible. This is, in fact, the start of the whole divide between the right and the left as a global conflict between Britain and France at the time of the French Revolution. You could argue that the right and the left division comes out of the mercantilist versus capitalist division, which Britain and France fought each other over between the 30 Years' War and the French Revolution. A lot of criticisms for this system are really criticisms of consensus liberalism rather than classical liberalism, although one did lead to the other. These societies were tough, masculine, creative, wealthy, and so many other things. If people can't tell, I am a British-style conservative and am biased towards this system. The problem here is that British rightism is built off very expensive cultural technologies. Keep in mind, over 90% of societies in human history are monarchies, which means monarchies are easier to socially maintain. Republics over history are incredibly disproportionate in the most excellent societies, whether America, Britain, the Dutch, Athenians, Venetians, or Romans. Republics tend to be in the top 5% of income for whatever era they're in. This means that a capitalist republic is often a good system to have, but difficult to keep. In order to have a republic, you need to have property-owning, educated, moral, religious, and a probably homogenous population in which warfare is democratized and men are expected to serve in the military. I explain for all of these why they're necessary with this text wall. If you remove even one of these, you don't get a republic, and this is also why republics tend to only live for short periods of time with very limited voting franchises, where in Victorian Britain or classical Athens, less than 10% of the population could vote, since they were the people who checked off all of the boxes above. Also, almost all urbanized republics are European, which adds in another winnowing variable. Once you remove one of those variables, the republic devolves into mob rule, in which people use the democracy for vote buying and petty envy, rather than pushing the group's good. This is taboo to say, but it doesn't stop it from being true. Within a generation of universal suffrage, Europe went from one of the most important places in the world politically, economically, socially, technologically, and militarily to none of those things. Meanwhile, universal suffrage worked much better in America, where most people were property owners or stakeholders. As the ancients said, the endpoint of democracy, and that democracies are historically pretty rare, is Caesarism and mob rule once one of those social institutions decays. In both ancient Greece, Rome, and the modern West, an original idea of excellence over time gets watered down to equality, which becomes an agenda for envy past a certain point. The great irony is that the classical liberals dig their own graves in two ways. The first is that it's such an effective system that it makes society so wealthy it loses the vigor necessary for the high social trust that follows the common good in democracy, and its structure naturally morphs into leftism, as in giving people the vote pushes for equality. An interesting point Paul Gottfried has made is that equality wasn't a principle of liberalism until the 20th century. For Victorian Britain or the American founding fathers, the mob was seen as a rabble that should be held back from burning society down, not empowered. Many liberals didn't support democracy democracy, but wanted monarchy, which pushed liberal values. Liberals of the 19th century were racist, imperialistic, nationalistic, misogynist, classist, and religious by today's standard. It's truly bizarre to see how liberalism was warped from its traditional meaning to the exact opposite. A very important variable is that British rightism is socially dependent on a strong Christian society, in that you can almost perfectly correlate the decline in Christianity with the decline of this form of rightism. This is for a variety of reasons, one being that without belief in God protecting us, people turn to the state to do so to assuage their anxieties. British rightism is very driven by elevating abstract moral principles like law, property rights, capitalism, and democracy, unlike most ideologies which are tribalistic, messianic, or religious. Thus, I think you can only get a population to support these kinds of abstract concepts once they're trained in religious ideals first. British rightism doesn't have a romantic, ideological, or religious worldview built into it and is thus dependent on Christianity to provide a moral and philosophic framework. Once religion got weaker, it was replaced by other ideologies which had better mythologies like communism or fascism. Part 3. German rightism. There's this whole debate that's gone back decades about whether or not Nazis and fascists are right-wing. It ends up falling into Sitch's law, or most debates are at the definition of a term, in that whether or not the Nazis are right-wing really depends on what definition of right-wing you're using. I personally think that the Nazis are conservative, and I think people who push against this are mostly libertarians and classical liberals who are tired of the left using the Nazi smear against British rightists who are really different. However, when I look at the Nazis, I see people who support their tribe first, sexual and class hierarchies, social traditions, and other traits that are very clearly rightist. It's also clear that if you put a gun to a classical liberal or libertarian's head and make them choose between fascism and communism, they'll almost always choose fascism. One of my definitions for whether you're on the right or the left is, if someone puts a gun to your head, will you push for Marxism or some nationalist ideology? In over a dozen places around the world, the fascists and classical liberals have allied against the Marxists. However, I can completely understand why someone would say that the fascists are left-wing. It's the whole horseshoe theory, in that once you get more radical to the right or the left, you end up circling back to the other side. You end up with removing the concept of the soul, believing the state should use social engineering to push society towards utopia. The idea group identities determine someone's complete character, the removal of a Christian value system, the use of scapegoating out groups to blame things on, distrust of capitalism, the free market, with pushing social collectivism, totalitarianism, conspiracy theories, and rule by the managerial class, just for some examples. One of the most important points I have stressed again and again in my videos is I never want to be enslaved by my own terms. As my favorite quote ever by the Zen Buddhist monk Dogon, do not confuse the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. And so this is why I frequently say for my civilization maps, I don't really care if Latin America is part of Western civilization or if Japan's part of Chinese civilization. Terms exist to serve us. We don't have to shove the world into terms. And I think past a certain point, the right versus left label is arbitrary, but up to that point, it's very much not arbitrary, in that these quote-unquote arbitrary social designations have informed the lives of billions of people over history and have changed the course of history. And you know a social institution is real once it can change the course of history through people's belief in it. Gaetano Mosca was a 1920s Italian thinker, and I think that whole 1920s Italian intellectual space was actually quite important and had a lot of very brilliant stuff that we've since forgotten, but he constructed a theory of elites. The leftist elites of our society are foxes in his system, in that they're clever at manipulating systems, psychological control, and indirect power. They're scared of using force or violence. Lions are the exact opposite, in that they get their power from strength and revere tradition. This system was interestingly developed in nations that modernized through their militaries. For a counterexample in the English-speaking world, and even France to a lesser degree, the Industrial Industrial Revolution was done through private initiative, with factory owners building industry off private capital to sell to the market. Meanwhile, in Germany, Russia, Japan, and a lesser extent Italy, industrialization was done by the government and their buddies in order to build armaments for the military. This created this very nationalistic, prideful, managerial bureaucracy which managed both the military and private enterprise. These became the dominant ruling class of these systems, and they all became command economies. A great irony is that the industrial process in the French and English-speaking worlds created elites who were foxes, in that the leading bureaucracy were people who came out of corporations who became very good at manipulating people through advertising to indirectly control the populace through what are effectively psyops. German rightism is fascism if you want to simplify things. I'm probably going to make a video sooner rather than later about analyzing the Nazis or fascism as a civilization or religion. However, it does go back further to around World War I, when Germany became a de facto military dictatorship with a socialist command economy. The fact that Germany was able to run an entire economy, not badly, off state planning, was a sign to totalitarians around the world for what could be accomplished. This system then spread to societies with similar military industrial systems like Italy or Japan. Russia was collectivist enough a society to go for left authoritarian rather than right, but I don't think that was in any way assured, and these systems, as said before, do have a lot in common. The view of the world the German right has is as if the whole human experience was a strategy video game. This is probably in no way a coincidence, given the German military command literally invented the first strategy war game simulations around World War I as a way to run military scenarios for future war plans. You have the pieces on your side or your nation. These pieces need to have complete loyalty to you. Then your goal is to acquire as many resources and terrain as possible. In this system, all of culture and society is leading towards the ability to have a greater military competitive advantage over your enemies. There are two key issues that stem from this. The first is a complete lack of context. Much like the left, the German right is able to make a completely wrong and insane worldview and believe it. The worst thing is the demons of their own minds killed millions and stopped them from winning again and again. Hitler believed that an invasion of Russia would be easy given Russians were racially inferior, or that President Franklin Roosevelt was a Jew. This is very much one of the tunnel vision ideologies, that it does the opposite of what it should, in that for a good ideology, the more that you believe it, the more the world makes sense, but with a bad ideology, the reverse happens. The second issue is the German right is seen as completely untrustworthy by everyone else. Interestingly, out of anyone, this faction has gone the furthest away from a Christian value system, even though they normally claim to be Christians. The Axis ended up fighting a coalition of nations with 20 times their population, since the world realized the fascists weren't trustworthy, and the fascists' egos were so big that they thought they would win. To change topics, the German right is normally propelled into power by normal people who were tired of some period of chaos. For example, Germany's tragedy that came starting with World War I, or the massive social changes implicit to Japan after industrialization. For all of these, the fascists' biggest base of support were the normal middle class and petty shopkeepers. The thing is that once said fascist regimes took power, they became incredibly socially constrictive. Fascist society covers how people go to work, school, social life, mating, religion, politics, or war, where you just follow your superior's orders. The Nazis were in control of every single aspect of the average German's life. Every single moment of how you lived was controlled by the government. Ironically, for both the communists and Nazis, they rose to power based off offering the working classes a better quality of life, but both immediately once they gained power, one of the first things they did was put a wage cap on workers' quality of life. However, as Erich Hofer said, the origin of totalitarianism is a freedom from freedom, and so the average people of these societies drew comfort from a totalitarian system which monitored every aspect of their life. All the wealthy nations of the world, with a few exceptions today, have originally warrior cultures. The Japanese, English, or Germans were proud warrior nations, before subliminating it into capitalism. This is since the traits that make one good at war are the exact same traits that make someone good at business, like creative thinking, risk-taking, group cohesion, and organization. Ironically, one of the main purposes of the American Empire is to take proud warrior nations and then redirect their manhood into making money while gradually domesticating them. German rightism is basically a military with a nation attached, since given if you industrialize using the military, then the whole society will end up taking militaristic traits. This is all well and good, but German rightism's basically dead today, right? There are really no fascist countries in the world left. I guess this is a theme for this whole video, in that the post-World War II era has resulted in the left winning around the world at the expense of various forms of conservative, at least on a cultural basis. The right wins elections from time to time, but the left creeps over the entire social structure, meaning that even if the right wins in politics, the ground they stand on is gradually sinking culturally and sociologically. Yes, German rightism is largely dead today, but if you look at the new factions of the right, this is a group that's growing in popularity. I often feel more alone on the right as a British rightist, given German rightists are growing rapidly. It's unclear what's going to happen now, but I'd be very surprised if this is the last rendition of German rightism, as I explained in this text wall. Keep in mind, we never disproved Nazism. We merely made it socially taboo to talk about. Nazism rose due to the insanity of Weimar and the depravity of the German left. We live in very similar conditions today due to poverty, social chaos, leftist insanity, and social void, similar to conditions that led to the Nazis. Ironically, the left, in being so anti-Nazi, has in turn made the Nazis look cool. If you tell white men again and again that if they're against the death of their own civilization, their total dispossession from public life and constant ritual humiliation, past a certain point, being a Nazi will look pretty attractive. Part 4. Muslim rightism. I'm going to do something unexpected here. Lots of you might think that looking at radical Islam has nothing to do with the Western right. You know, that's probably true, but I think the Muslim world has implicit in it a model of conservatism that could foreshadow future events in the West. Seeing how the Muslim world over the last few decades has pushed a conservative messianic ideology that is in many ways comparable in the scale of communism is a fascinating picture of what future Western conservatism could look like. Most Westerners see Islam as this inherently primitive, savage, theocratic civilization. The reality, though, is that medieval Islam was the most advanced, free-thinking, scientific, tolerant society in the world at the time. Starting around the 11th century, Islamic culture started to fossilize. Thus, by the time we get to the Industrial Revolution, the West had gained an enormous advantage over Islam. What we've seen with ISIS, the Taliban, or Al-Qaeda is a very recent movement, one which formed as a reaction to modernity and colonialism. Up until the 1970s, women would wear bikinis in Iran or Lebanon. My mom grew up in Iran in the 1970s, and it was a very different country then. Due to the humiliation of Western colonialism, which the Muslim world had tremendous trouble adjusting to, given they had always seen themselves as superior to the Christians, gave the Muslim world a crisis of identity. They solved this in the second half of the 20th century by pushing a variety of Islam, which wanted a return to the pure days under the Prophet Muhammad. That would result in God favoring Islam so that they could beat the West. This came in a variety of different forms I won't get into. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Arabs funded Wahhabism around the Muslim world. Wahhabism was an ideology developed around the time of the American Revolution in 18th century Arabia, which remained obscure until the 20th century. Wahhabism has flowered into a bunch of different forms, whether Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, the Saudi monarchy, amongst others. The Iranian version is Shia Messianism, or bringing about the Book of Revelation. Radical Islam is fascinating to see since it affronts our concept of history that we should be moving towards the direction of progress, secularism, equality, feminism, among other things. Radical Islam has created a new messianic movement that men will die for that is compelling enough that it keeps popping up in different locations. An idea that hard to kill is something that should be studied. Radical Islam was to our era what communism communism was to the 20th century or liberalism was to the 19th. In that lens, it's a fascinating conservative movement. When I was a child, and keep in mind I grew up in the war on terror after 9/11, I always wondered how Al-Qaeda could get men to be suicide bombers. I wondered why anyone would be willing to die for their cause. Getting nearly 100 virgins is a pretty good motivator, I guess. I completely understand now, given as life has gotten crappier in America, it removes reasons to not die. If you can't get a family, are poor and hopeless, then a messianic ideology which gives you glory and death looks appealing. Radical Islam has harnessed the Islamic school shooter demographic to their advantage. It gives young Islamic men a sense of masculinity in a world where otherwise they're stuck with little social mobility, removal from traditional village structures due to urbanization, while their societies were emasculated by the West. Radical Islam in many ways is an outgrowth of how the Muslim world experienced rapid population growth in the 20th century without the increases in industrialization that should come with that, thus meaning there are large amounts of underemployed young men who go into war for some chance of getting a better life. I remember my father once told me in his 20s he was looking at a demographic chart of the Middle East, and he thought, with that many young men, they have to have a war, because Europe and the Western world and China all had wars when they had their population booms in the 20th century. And it's ironic he turned out to be right. I'm sure people here are familiar with the negatives of radical Islam. Its treatment of women as an example, which is horrifying. ISIS using sex slaves, massive corruption, or atrocities. I grew up in the wake of 9/11 when radical Islam was the bogeyman Americans were supposed to hate. In fact, radical Islam has been in decline over the last 10 years, given the Muslim world has realized the radicals don't have the answer to Islam's issues. The fundamentalists, upon getting power, were just as, if not more corrupt than the older regimes. Islam clearly did not return to the golden age under the Prophet Muhammad. The Muslim world is today in a place of transition now that this old wave of radicalism is dying out, while at the same time a lot of the Muslim world is becoming more fundamentalist. Traditionally secular Muslim countries like Indonesia or Turkey have becoming legally and politically more and more Muslim. A great irony is at the exact same time, religiosity in the Muslim world has been collapsing precipitously for about a decade. Collapse in religiosity in the Muslim world has been very heavily correlated with the adoption of TikTok. America is now a more religious country with a higher birth rate than Iran. I have a Saudi friend who tells me that Saudi Arabian women are now feminists. With all this going on, I have no idea what trajectory Islam will be on in a generation or two. A fascinating thread here, and one that people very rarely point out, but which plays into something I was trying to get to before, is that radical Islam is in many ways based off communism. The idea of this messianic ideology, which once people adopt it, will reach a utopia. Communism never had much of an appeal in the Islamic world, where communism thrives with the breakdown of religion and family, which didn't happen in Islam. However, lots of Muslims studied communism in the 20th century and rebranded it into a form that was comprehensible to them. Like communism, fascism, or any other fanatical ideology, the issue radical Islam keeps on finding is that once your worldview is that hardcore, it naturally wipes out a lot of potential allies and you end up alienating all of your neighbors. This is a very difficult balance to reach, of between having fanatical in-group loyalty while not making the whole world hate you. However, this balance is necessary for a successful revolutionary movement. ISIS pissed off basically every single neighboring country as an example for why they lost. Radical Islam has been effective at giving an identity to Muslims who exist in a culturally strange situation. People have studied the lives of Muslim terrorists inside Europe, and they all have a roughly similar pattern. A young man is a second-generation immigrant. He doesn't have the community that his family did back in their home countries. He's neither from his home country, but also hasn't assimilated into the native European culture. Keep in mind, unemployment among Muslims in Europe is staggeringly high. For young men, often something like 40%. They go through a phase of trying to acclimate to Western culture, drinking, going to clubs, dating girls. Then they find that this is disgusting and, in the degeneracy, get converted to Islam. Islam. They clean up their lives, but then start killing people. I'm pointing this out since it's actually a very common pattern among white Western men today. White Western men have the exact same issues, in that they feel like they are in cultural limbo, while the social path the culture gives them is towards degeneracy. Then they often turn to religion or conservative politics to give them a value system to orient their lives. I actually think it's not unlikely that a new conservative ideology ends up fulfilling a similar role to radical Islam for disaffected white men. Christianity, until very recently, was a violent religion, and the West is at its core a warrior civilization. If you push a warrior society too far, it's going to fight back. The lesson I want to tease out with radical Islam is that, contrary to popular belief, even amongst conservatives, the future does not belong to the left. Much like the left, radical Islam created a messianic image of the future, pushing opposite goals to reach a pretty similar place. In the West, we could see the protesters in the street demanding a return to traditional purity, God, and national greatness, rather than equality, secularism, and progress. The right is just as capable of making messianic suicide bomber ideologies. As a British rightist, this is something that the German and Islamic rightists do that we don't. It's also beyond bizarre to see the alliance that's developed between the left and radical Islam. I think it's a one-sided crush on the part of the left due to hating white Western civilization so much. The Muslims view the left with contempt and use the relationship whenever it's convenient for them, while the left sees them as useful allies. This is something Philippe Fabry, who's a fan of the show, brilliantly predicted, called the Islamo-leftism, which I thought was too insane to be real, but he was correct, and here we are. Islamo-leftism is most popular in Europe due to the strange politics in which the incentive is for the left to ally with Muslims. A reason I put this group in is that I wanted to represent the religious fundamentalist faction of the right. The left likes to imagine Christian religious fundamentalists totally dominate American society. That's not really true, in that yes, the Bible Belt is an important faction and backer for the Republicans, but they're not the ruling class or driving force. America is not going to become a Christian fundamentalist state anytime soon unless a massive movement forms. I can barely think of any Christian fundamentalist conservative thought leaders or ways they can manifest in the dominant institutions of society. In America, the only country in the Western world to have any degree of Christian influence, they're stuck in an alliance with British rightism now and potentially with others. However, I don't think that gives the potential for a religious fundamentalist right credit in the West. If the right does go into that direction, it would have to be a new messianic crazy force. If religious fundamentalists do take over the West, it would have to look a lot like radical Muslims. People on the right often say they want the Christians to win. I don't think they understand what that actually means. A legitimately philosophically Christian society involves demons being taught in psychology textbooks, adultery being illegal, and churches being the top social network. Conclusions. With all of this being said, here's my read about conservatives in general. There are 4 different groups which fight the left for different reasons. Peruvian conservatives fight against the left given they are the status quo and they stand to lose if the left wins. An example of a conflict like this is the French Revolution. The second form, British conservatives, fight against leftism given they support property rights, freedom, and an open market, since they are driven by the merchant classes. The left wants to remove the merchant classes. An example of this kind of conflict is the current American culture war, fought between the left and classical liberal American conservatives. For the longest period, it's a conflict between consensus liberals versus classical liberals, although both sides have become less liberal over the last 5 years. German rightists fight the left since their power is based off a martial and masculine warlike culture. The left would destroy the national cultures upon which their societies are founded. An example of that conflict is World War II on the Eastern Front, fought between Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany. The final battle, that between radical Islam and the left, occurs to them being too much of competitors. You can't have two messianic ideologies in the same society, and radical Islam or communism both demand the complete souls of their followers. An example of this, in turn, is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I know many of the brightest minds of the right are watching this video now. I ask you guys this question: which of these futures do you want? An important fact here is that for one reason or another, all of these ideologies have failed. Peruvian style can't survive industrialization. British style sows its own defeat by turning society into something inhospitable to it. German style blew itself up with the world wars, while Islamic style proved it couldn't bring about Muhammad's utopia. Given that all of these have failed, while the left is also failing now, it opens up a great question. What right do we want? What elements do you like or dislike from each faction? The right has no clue what it's doing now. I was trying to mentally subdivide the demographics of conservatives today, and what I found is that most rightists don't know what they want. We're in a period of chaos where a bunch of things are happening, and people want an answer. In this historic moment, in my opinion, it's important for us to look back on the history of the right carefully. What has already succeeded or failed in the past? We are in one of those hinge moments of history when the right is evolving into something completely new. The decision is up to us. It's scary, but it's also fun and liberating. What answer do you want?